She heard it through a door that was three-quarters closed. Her husband's voice, low, satisfied. The voice of a man who has already counted his winnings before the game is done. "She'll take what I give her. She always does." She was standing in the hallway, holding a glass of water, completely still, not shaking, not crying, not falling apart the way you think you would if your entire life cracked open in a single sentence. Just still. Because here is what nobody tells you about the moment of betrayal. It doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it arrives like a door clicking shut, quiet, final. And somehow, you already knew. Margaret had been the perfect wife for 23 years. The woman who kept the house running, raised the son, smiled in every photograph, stood slightly off-center in every frame because the camera always found her husband first. What her husband did not know. What his mother did not know. What his lawyer did not know. What every single person who laughed when they planned this divorce did not know was that while they were busy not looking at her, she had built an empire, $430 million, and she built it in silence, because that is what happens when you underestimate a woman for 23 years and she keeps working anyway. Stay with me. Because what happens next, in that divorce room, when the papers are signed, when the laughter stops, is something you will want to hear all the way to the end. This is not just a story about betrayal. This is a story about what a woman builds when no one is watching, and what happens the day she finally decides to let them see. If this is the kind of story that speaks to you, hit like, leave a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your sign. Every story on this channel is built for women who are ready to stop being quiet about who they really are.
She has no idea. She never does. Margaret Calloway stopped walking. She was in the hallway, the one outside the home office, the office Douglas converted from the dining room 7 years ago, the room where they used to eat as a family, the room she still missed sometimes on Sunday mornings when the house was quiet. The door was three-quarters closed. She was holding a glass of water, cold. She had poured it for herself in the kitchen and then forgotten she was carrying it, the way you forget things when the day has been long and ordinary and you are moving through your own house on muscle memory alone. Douglas's voice came through the gap, low, certain, the particular register he used when he already knew the answer and was simply announcing it. She did not move. Later, she would tell herself she froze, that her legs simply stopped, that staying was not a choice but a failure of the body to receive the signal to go. But here's the truth she would only allow herself at 2 a.m, 3 weeks from now, lying in the guest room because the bed she had shared for 23 years no longer felt like something she could occupy. She stayed because part of her already knew, part of her had known for months, maybe longer. She just had not given herself permission to hear it yet. "She'll take what I give her," Douglas said. A pause. An exhale. The soft, satisfied sound of a man who has done his arithmetic and liked the result. She always does. The water glass was cold against her sternum. She realized she was pressing it there, like she was trying to keep something inside from getting out. She took 1 step back, then 2, then 3. She was in the kitchen before she exhaled. The glass went on the counter. She looked at her hands. They were completely steady. She thought, with the strange, clear part of her that was always noticing things, even when the rest of her was falling. This seems wrong. She thought she would be shaking. She thought discovery would arrive with trembling and tears and the kind of noise you hear in movies. She was not shaking. She was very, very still. She stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, through the window, over the sink, the garden held its ordinary evening light. Everything looked exactly the same. Nothing was. Here is what Margaret Calloway had been for 23 years. A wife, a mother, the woman who made sure the dry cleaning was retrieved on Thursdays, and the pediatric appointments were scheduled, and the social calendar was maintained, and the right people were invited to the right dinners at the right times. The woman, Douglas Calloway, introduced at dinner parties as my wife Meg, in a tone that made her sound like a pleasant accessory to a full and important life, like a good coat, useful, tasteful, present without demanding attention. She was 48 years old, dark hair threaded now with silver she had stopped coloring 2 years ago. Douglas said he preferred the natural look. He said it in a tone that was meant to sound like approval. It felt, if she pressed on it, like something more dismissive, like permission she had not asked for and should not have needed. She had graduated at the top of her class at a university that people recognized. She spoke French fluently and Italian passably, and had once, in a hotel lobby in Barcelona, successfully negotiated a price dispute in Spanish, which she had never formally studied. She had read close to 800 books in 23 years, because books were what she had when the rest of her life narrowed to something she could not quite name. And for 11 years, quietly, without fanfare, without Douglas's awareness of the full picture, she had been running a company, not a hobby, a company, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, Meg Calloway is standing in her kitchen at 7:45 in the evening, and she is just beginning to understand that the man in the next room has been planning something. Something that was decided without her, something that has been in motion for a while now, and she was the last to know. She picked up the water glass. She went upstairs. On the way up, she checked her phone 3 times. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock, lock. She did not know what she was looking for. She had been doing this for months, some automatic vigilance she could not explain and had not examined. She put the phone face down on the nightstand. She lay down on top of the covers, fully dressed, and looked at the ceiling. She did not sleep. 3 days after the phone call, Meg found the text thread. She was not looking for it. She picked up Douglas's phone to check the weather. Her own phone was charging across the room, and it was the kind of small domestic logic that governs a long marriage. His charger, her side of the bed. Her charger, his. Years of accumulated intimacy in the smallest possible exchanges. The thread was open on the screen. He had left it open, which meant he was careless. Or, and this arrived with the specific cold clarity of something she did not want to examine directly, he simply had not considered that she might see it, because she was not the kind of woman people considered a threat. She was Meg. She was the coat, the name at the top of the thread, 23 messages in the past 48 hours. She read the first one, then the second. She put the phone on the kitchen counter. She walked to the bathroom. She held her wrists under cold water for 30 seconds. Not for any particular reason, just to have something to do with her hands while she decided what to do next. She was not going to fall apart yet, not before she knew everything. She went back to the kitchen. She read all of it. The messages were not graphic. They were, in their own way, worse than graphic. They were domestic. They referenced hotel preferences and scheduling and logistics. And then, in one message, the one she read 3 times, 3 simple words: tell her you have a conference. She won't question it. Tell her, her. 23 years together, and she was a lowercase pronoun in her husband's private world. She, her. Not Meg, not my wife, not any name that acknowledged her as a person with a full and complicated interior life and a history and a company she had spent 11 years building. Just her. She put the phone face down on the counter. She looked out the kitchen window at the garden, the same garden she had tended for 16 years, the roses she planted the spring Tyler started kindergarten. The Japanese maple Douglas had chosen because he liked the color of it in October. She thought, I'm going to have to do something with this information. Not today. She was not ready today, but soon. The inner voice arrived like something stepping out of a shadow. All the signs were there. I filed them away. I told myself they meant nothing. I was good at that. I had years of practice. She was shocked. She still wanted there to be an explanation. Some version of the story that was innocent. She knew it did not exist. The wanting to believe part was simply louder right now than the knowing part. It would take a few more days before the knowing won. She picked up her phone, checked it 3 times. Lock, unlock, lock. She put it face down. She lay in the dark that night for a long time. She was beginning, for the first time, to think. The days between discovery and action had a particular quality. She watched him at dinner, over the rim of her wine glass, passing the bread, laughing at something on his phone he did not share with her. The ordinary geography of a marriage that had become, she was beginning to understand, a performance she was giving to an audience of one who had stopped paying attention years ago. She watched him, the way you study something you have decided you may not recognize anymore. She drove past the elementary school, where Tyler learned to read. Habit. She took a longer route home for no reason she could name. She stood in the pantry one evening and reorganized every shelf, every can label facing forward, every box in its alphabetical place. At 9:30 at night, with nothing to say for itself except that it was the only thing she could control right now, and control was what she needed. The inner voice, very quiet, very certain. I know what I saw. I'm not crazy. I know exactly what I'm looking at. She did not confront him, not yet. She called her sister instead. Diane answered on the second ring, the way Diane always answered. Like she had been expecting the call, and was mildly impatient that it had taken this long. Tell me, Diane said. Meg had meant to say nothing. She said, I think Doug is having an affair. 1 second of silence, then Diane said, I know. You know, Meg repeated. Not a question, a statement she was processing. I heard something from Carol Mitchum, Diane said, at Tyler's graduation party, last spring. I didn't tell you because I didn't know if it was real and I didn't want to. How long, Diane? A careful pause, the kind of pause that has had months to grow heavy. Carol said at minimum 8 months, Diane said. 8 months. Tyler's graduation party was last spring. Meg had planned every detail of that party herself. The catering, the flowers, the guest list, the blue dress Douglas had said made her look nice in a tone that landed somewhere between affection and assessment. She had smiled in every photograph. She was gracious and warm and completely in the dark. And in the background of those photographs, people knew. I'll call you back, Meg said. She hung up carefully. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where 23 years of breakfasts had happened, where Tyler had done homework, where she had wrapped Christmas presents at midnight for 16 years running. She sat there for a long time. She thought, there are things I need to find out, and I am going to find them out carefully. Not in a panic, not with a confrontation that gives him the advantage of my emotions. I am going to find out everything first. Then I am going to decide what to do. She made a call not to a lawyer, not yet, to a contact in the hotel industry, a woman she had met years ago through her business, someone Douglas had never known about, because Douglas did not know the full scope of her business. She asked for a discreet favor. The favor was granted. 48 hours later, she had a name, Amber Schultz, 31 years old, an event coordinator at the hotel chain Douglas's company used for conferences. Blonde, pretty in photographs. Her professional headshots had the quality of someone who had gotten a job she wasn't sure she deserved and hadn't quite caught up to herself yet. She was not what Meg had expected. Meg had imagined someone different, sure of herself. The mistress of 100 stories is always certain. She always knows what she is doing, and does it anyway. She is the clear, identifiable villain. Amber Schultz looked like someone's younger cousin at a formal event. Slightly overdressed, slightly uncertain. And then the contact called back with one more piece of information. Amber Schultz had resigned from the hotel company 3 months ago. She was 26 weeks pregnant. Meg sat with this. 26 weeks pregnant, no job. And from what she could piece together from the text thread, from what Douglas had presumably told her, she was waiting for him to handle the situation. Believing him when he said it was handled, because he was handling it, just not the way Amber thought. What Douglas was actually handling, Meg was beginning to understand, was 14 months of quiet asset movement through their household accounts. Careful, unhurried. The financial preparation of a man who has decided on an outcome and is simply making sure the architecture favors him. She found this by accident, or not quite by accident, by paying the kind of attention she had always paid to numbers, even when numbers were not supposed to be her department. She printed 3 months of account statements. She sat at the kitchen table at 11 at night with a highlighter. By midnight, she had found 7 transactions she could not explain. By 1 in the morning, she had found 14. She made herself stop. She made herself go to bed. She lay in the dark and breathed slowly and thought about Amber Schultz. 26 weeks, unemployed, believing Douglas Calloway when he said everything was handled. The anger was real and immediate. And underneath it, and this surprised her, something else. Something she did not want and could not quite get rid of. A specific kind of sorrow. Not for the affair, for the version of Amber who had believed him. Because Meg knew exactly what it felt like to believe Douglas Calloway when he said everything was fine. She drove across the city on a Thursday morning to a coffee shop she had never been to. Not the one near their neighborhood, where the baristas knew her name and her order and would notice that something was different about her today. This one was anonymous. Chrome counters and indie music and baristas who processed customers without looking up. She ordered a coffee she did not drink. She sat with it for 40 minutes. She thought about the word hobby. Douglas had used it at dinner once. A year ago, maybe more, she had mentioned a partnership opportunity. Something significant. He had cut a piece of steak and said, without looking up, "I just think it's a lot of exposure for something that's still a hobby." Hobby. He said it casually. Not to wound. He genuinely believed it. That was the thing. He looked at 11 years of her work and he saw a hobby. Because she had let him. Because keeping it small in his eyes felt safer than letting him see it clearly and risk him wanting to manage it. She had contributed to her own invisibility. That thought arrived without mercy. She sat with it. She did not want it to be true. It was true anyway. The inner voice, landing hard and clear. He never tried to see me, and I made it easy for him not to. She left the coffee shop. She did not finish the coffee. She sat in the car in the parking lot for 8 minutes, looking at nothing in particular, the way you sit when you have just understood something you cannot ununderstand. Then she picked up her phone and called Charlotte Wentworth. Charlotte answered on the second ring. "I need you to clear your afternoon," Meg said. "Done," Charlotte said. No questions, no pause. "Where?" "The office." 1 o'clock? She hung up. She started the car. For the first time since the hallway, she felt something other than shock. She felt very quietly like herself. The office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, not the one Douglas had ever been to. He had never asked where it was. She had never offered the address. She had understood, somewhere early on, that her work was something he would either dismiss or try to direct, and neither was acceptable. So the office existed in a part of her life he did not visit. The lobby smelled like coffee and good carpet. The receptionist knew her name and had her coffee ready. She walked through a set of glass doors into a space that was entirely hers. Meg sat at her desk. She was calm. She was not fine, but calm was available, and today calm would do. Charlotte arrived at 1:05. She was 63 years old and was slightly overdressed for a Thursday afternoon in the way she was always slightly overdressed, as if she had decided years ago that dressing down simply was not worth the effort. She sat across from Meg and looked at her. "Tell me everything," Charlotte said. So Meg did. The hallway, the phone call, the text thread, Amber, the pregnancy, the asset movement, all of it. She did not organize it for presentation. She did not soften it for another person's comfort. She laid it out in order. Charlotte listened without interrupting. This was one of the things Meg had always valued most about her. Charlotte was not a person who filled silence. When Meg finished, Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "How long has he been moving money?" she asked. 14 months at minimum. He doesn't know what you have. He's structuring for a negotiation he thinks he's already won. Yes. Charlotte looked at her with an expression that was close. For Charlotte, to gentle. He's about to be surprised. "I want to do this right," Meg said. "I want to be careful. I don't want this to become a war if it doesn't have to be," Charlotte said. "Meg, he made it a war before you knew there was a war. You're just deciding to show up." Meg sat with that for a moment. The inner affirmation arrived. Not loud, but very clear. "I know what I have. I know what I built. I deserve to be treated as exactly what I am." "Get me the name of the best divorce attorney in this state," she said. Charlotte already had the number. She had had it for a while. Franklin Adler's office smelled like old paper and the particular kind of organized quiet that costs money. He was 57, half-moon glasses, a rumpled suit that fit perfectly, which suggested the rumpling was aesthetic rather than accidental. He had the manner of a man who had been present for the worst days of many lives and learned to remain still in all of them. He spent 40 minutes reviewing what Meg brought him. Then he removed his glasses. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "before we discuss strategy, I want to make sure I understand your situation fully. When you say your business holdings are independent of the marital estate, the corporate structure was established 11 years ago," Meg said. "Before the company generated significant revenue, Charlotte Wentworth's firm provided seed capital. That capital was repaid in full within 4 years. Every dollar of revenue since then is fully documented, and the documentation is unbroken, 11 years, every quarter." Franklin put his glasses back on, looked at the papers again, took them off again. "All right," he said. "Then let me tell you something clearly. Douglas's legal team is going to approach this case with certain assumptions. Those assumptions are going to be incorrect. What I need you to understand is what that means for how we proceed." "Tell me," she said. "We do not reveal the full picture until the moment it is strategically optimal to do so," Franklin said. "We let them build their case on the foundation they believe is solid, and then at the right moment, we show them what the foundation is actually standing on." Meg nodded. "And what is it standing on?" she asked, though she already knew. "Nothing," Franklin said. "Their case is standing on the assumption that you are a financially dependent spouse with limited independent resources. The moment that assumption is corrected, their entire strategy collapses." He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Calloway, how do you feel about going into this process as the underdog?" "I have practice," she said. Something moved in Franklin's expression. Not quite a smile, the acknowledgement of one. "Then let's begin," he said. Vivian Calloway called on a Thursday morning. She wanted to have lunch, the new French restaurant in the city. She said lovely 3 times in 30 seconds, which was how Meg knew the lunch was about something specific. She said yes. She had said yes to Vivian for 23 years. The restaurant was exactly what Vivian called lovely. Cream walls, white tablecloths, the ambient sound of polite conversation and silverware on porcelain. Vivian was already seated when Meg arrived. Pearl earrings, a lilac cardigan, the faint signature of lavender perfume she had worn as long as Meg had known her. They ordered soup. They talked about Tyler. They talked about Vivian's garden. Then 40 minutes in, midway through the soup course, Meg set down her spoon. "How long have you known about Amber?" she said. The question landed quietly, without heat, like something placed carefully on a surface. Vivian's hand moved to her left pearl earring. The tell. Meg had known about it for years. Vivian touched the left pearl when she was calculating. When the ground was less stable than she wanted it to appear. The pause that followed was long enough to count. Then, darling. The word landed exactly as it always did. The warmth that was performance. The reminder, folded inside the endearment, of Meg's position in the hierarchy of this family. "I advised him to handle it quietly," Vivian said. Her voice was perfectly even. "For everyone's sake, including yours." "How long, Vivian?" The pearl earring turned between thumb and finger. 2 years, she said. The restaurant continued its pleasant ambient noise. The soup was still warm. The afternoon light fell in the same pattern it had been falling in. 2 years. 2 years of dinners and holidays and phone calls and Sunday lunches. 2 years of Vivian calling her darling in that particular tone. 2 years of being kept comfortable in a structure that was being quietly redesigned around her. For her own good. "I thought it would pass," Vivian continued. "These things often do, in a marriage of any significant length. I thought if you didn't know, you wouldn't be hurt." The inner voice arrived like a door closing. She decided. She took something that belonged to me, the right to know my own life, and she decided I didn't need it. Like a child, like furniture, like my knowing was less important than her son's convenience. Meg picked up her spoon. She took one more bite of soup. She set the spoon down with great care. "Vivian," she said, very quietly, "I want you to hear this clearly. I will only say it once." Vivian went still. "You made a choice that was not yours to make," Meg said. "I won't forget it, and I won't carry it. That belongs to you." She set her napkin beside her bowl. She signaled for the check. She paid for both lunches. Something deliberate, a small, precise reversal of who provides in this dynamic. She left Vivian at the table. In the car, she called Franklin. "I need an appointment this week if possible." "Thursday morning," he said. 8 o'clock. "I'll be there." She hung up. She gripped the steering wheel with both hands. The outrage was real, hot and present and specific. Not the shapeless anger of betrayal, but the precise fury of someone who has been managed, who is treated as a variable to be controlled rather than a person to be told the truth. And underneath the outrage, forming slowly, solidly, the way things form when they have been waiting long enough, a plan. She drove home on the long route, past the elementary school, past the park, past the coffee shop where she had met Charlotte 11 years ago for the first time, and Charlotte had looked at the business model she'd brought on 3 pages of yellow legal paper and said, 4 minutes in, "The model is sound. What do you need?" She drove slowly, not because she was in no hurry. She was, in some essential way, in a considerable hurry now, but because she was doing something she had not permitted herself to do in years. Looking. Really looking. At the city she had lived in for 23 years. At the streets and the light on the buildings and the ordinary people moving through their ordinary Friday afternoon. She pulled into a small waterfront parking area she used to visit before the children. Before the house, before the accumulated architecture of a life built around someone else's shape. She parked. She looked at the water. It was gray today. The color of a thought you're not sure you want to finish. She sat for 7 minutes. She thought, I have been in a house for 23 years, and I have been fully in my own life for 11 of them. 11 years in the office, 11 years of building something real, and in the other 12 years, in the dinner parties, and the social calendar, and the dry cleaning, and the being nice, I was somewhere else. Present, but not quite here. She was not being self-pitying. She was being accurate. There is a difference. She started the car. She drove home. She did not pretend to sleep that night. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table. She waited for morning. Morning came, the way mornings do. She was ready for it. The call from Patsy came on a Tuesday evening. Meg almost did not answer. She saw the name on the screen, Patricia Hartwell, which was how Patsy had always appeared in her phone, the full formal version of a name nobody actually used. And she let it ring twice. Then she answered. Hey, Patsy said. Her voice had something in it, a texture Meg recognized from 19 years of friendship. The sound of someone who has been working up to saying something and has finally decided it has to be now. Hey, Meg said. A pause. Meg, Patsy said, I need to tell you something. I need you to let me finish before you say anything. The kitchen went quiet. Meg put her coffee mug down, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who senses the next 30 seconds will require both hands free. I knew about Amber, Patsy said. Silence. I found out 8 months ago. A mutual friend told me and I... The pause carried weight, all 8 months of it. I told myself you'd find out on your own. That it wasn't my place to say something. That if I told you, it would make it real before you were ready. Meg did not respond. But the truth is... Patsy's voice broke slightly, just slightly, then steadied. I was scared. If I told you, everything would blow up. You'd be in crisis. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to hold that with you. I didn't know if I could be what you needed. A long pause. I was protecting myself, Patsy said, very quietly, like a confession, in a church where someone else is praying. I told myself it was protecting you, but it was myself. The silence that followed had weather in it. Meg looked around the kitchen, the reorganized pantry with every label facing forward. The coffee maker Douglas had chosen that she had always quietly disliked. The window over the sink and through it, the garden in its ordinary evening light. I have no one left who is exactly who I thought they were. The thought arrived without drama, simple and devastating. Not one single person in this whole life. I am standing in 23 years of accumulated history, and I have never been this alone. She said, I need some time. Patsy said, I know. I'm not done with you, Meg said. Not a threat, a clarification. The statement of someone who is angry and sad and not yet ready to decide what either of those things means. I just need time first. I'll be here, Patsy said, very quietly. Okay, Meg said. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she opened the pantry. She began to reorganize it. Every can label forward. Every box in alphabetical order. The kind of order you construct when everything else is burning. The kind of control you manufacture from the small and manageable, because the large and unmanageable is currently beyond your reach. She did this for 2 hours. At midnight, the pantry was perfect. She was still alone. But she had gotten through 2 hours, and that was something. The call from Amber came on a Saturday morning. Unknown number. Meg almost didn't answer. She answered anyway. Mrs. Calloway? The voice was younger than she had expected, slightly breathless. The sound of someone who has rehearsed a speech and is now off script and trying to find her footing. Yes, Meg said. I know I have no right to call you. I know that. A pause, a collected breath. He told me you knew about us. He said you'd agreed to the divorce before we started. He said it was already over between you two before he ever... She stopped, started again. I didn't know he was still married, not at the beginning. And when I did find out, he told me it was basically done, that you'd agreed. He said not to worry. Meg was very still. I'm not calling to make excuses, Amber said. I'm calling because he's told me that not to get my own lawyer. He wants me to use his family's attorney for the arrangements about the baby. And something about that felt wrong to me. Meg let out a slow breath. Amber, she said. Her voice was measured, not warm, not cold, something in between, which was the most honest register available right now. You need your own lawyer, completely independent of Douglas and his family. I know? Get one. Not his family's. Someone who represents only you. A pause. Then, in a voice Meg would think about for a long time afterward, I'm sorry. I know what that's worth, coming from me. I know it might be worth nothing at all, but I am. Meg looked out the window. The garden, the Japanese maple Douglas had chosen, because he liked the color of it in October. Take care of yourself, she said. Get a lawyer. She hung up. She sat with the strangeness of it. She was angry. That was true and real and present. She also felt, against all her preferences, something close to sorrow for a 31-year-old woman who was pregnant and unemployed and had believed Douglas Calloway, who had received the same assurances Meg had received for 23 years, who had trusted the confident certainty of a man who told everyone around him what they needed to hear to stay in their assigned positions. Both things were true simultaneously. The anger and the sorrow, sitting side by side, neither canceling the other. She was learning that you could feel more than one true thing at a time. That the complexity was not weakness, it was accuracy. She spent 3 evenings alone in the office that week, not doing anything in particular, just being there. The desk she had chosen, the chair she had broken in over 11 years, the photographs on the wall, a vineyard in Tuscany where she had signed her second major partnership, a Florentine leather workshop, the artisan's hands demonstrating a technique that had been in his family for 4 generations, a small hotel in Lyon where she had stayed during her first European trip for the company, jet-lagged and exhilarated and convinced she was about to make a serious mistake, and then didn't. This was her. This was the size she actually was. Not the coat, not the accessory, not the woman who stood slightly off-center in photographs, because the camera always found Douglas first. She thought about something Charlotte had said to her years ago, early in their partnership, when Meg was still half convinced she was out of her depth. You keep apologizing for taking up space, Charlotte had said, not unkindly, with the particular directness that was Charlotte's version of affection. Stop. It's inefficient and it's inaccurate. Meg had laughed then. She thought about it now. 12 years later, sitting at her own desk in her own office, she thought about it. She had spent 23 years taking up exactly the space that was assigned to her. No more, no less. Being the right size for Douglas's version of the life they were sharing, she was done with that. The inner affirmation arrived, quiet and permanent. Somewhere along the way, I became invisible. I participated in my own disappearance. That ends now. She locked the office. She walked to her car. She drove home through the city she had lived in for 23 years. She was beginning, she realized, to look forward to something. She had not looked forward to anything in a while. It felt like recovering a sense she had lost. Franklin Adler's conference room smelled like good coffee and paper. The table was long enough for serious documents, which was fortunate because the documents Meg placed on it were serious. His associate, a young woman with a precisely efficient manner and reading glasses she kept taking on and off, began going through the financial records. She stopped talking. The room went quiet. The associate set down the papers. She picked them up again. She looked at Meg. "These are the complete records," she said. Not quite a question. "Every quarter," Meg said. 11 years unbroken. Franklin's associate looked at the total figure on the independent valuation report. She set it down carefully. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "when did you begin?" 11 years ago, Meg said. "My first contract was in September of that year. A Tuscan leather goods family. 4 American boutique retailers. I connected them. It worked. And then I did it again with someone else. And again, and again." Franklin leaned forward and looked at the valuation figure. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, $430 million. "Conservative estimate," Meg said. "Morton, Vance & Glass conducted it 6 months ago. We can request an updated one if needed, but the trajectory has been upward." The room was very quiet. Franklin set down his own copy. He removed his glasses. He folded them. He placed them on the table with the deliberate care of a man who is using a small movement to manage a large response. "Douglas's legal team," he said slowly, "has filed this case on the assumption that you are a financially dependent spouse. Yes. They are expecting to negotiate from a position of significant structural advantage. Yes. Mrs. Calloway." He looked at her steadily. "They are going to walk into the mediation room and discover they are sitting across from one of the more financially significant private individuals in this state." "I know. How do you feel about that?" Meg considered the question. It deserved a considered answer. "I feel," she said, "like 23 years of being underestimated is about to do something useful for the first time." Something moved in Franklin Adler's expression. Something warm and deliberate and professional all at once. "Tell me about the corporate structure," he said. She told him. She did not go home after the meeting. She drove east, to the storage facility near the edge of the city, the low beige building with the coated gate and the fluorescent lights in the corridors, the place where she had put her mother's things after the house was sold. Boxes she had moved twice without opening, without being ready. Eleanor Whitfield had died 21 years ago. Breast cancer, fast-moving. She was 61 years old and in good health one season, and then the next was not. She left behind 3 daughters, a husband, a house full of ordinary objects, and a collection of small green notebooks. Meg knew which box. She had always known which box. She just had not been ready to open it until now. She lifted the lid. The notebooks were stacked in order, 12 of them, each labeled in Eleanor's handwriting, precise, slightly slanted, the penmanship of a woman who took her letters seriously. Meg lifted the top one. She opened it. The columns, the categories, groceries by week, by item, utilities, insurance, car maintenance, the small unexpected expenses that arrive in every life and are devastating when you have no framework for them. Every receipt accounted for, every irregular cost noted and explained. Her father's voice came back to her, warm and amused and loving. "Eleanor, the world won't end if you forget a receipt." And her mother's answer, patient and certain, "The world won't end, but you'll know about it." Meg sat down on the concrete floor. She sat with the notebooks in her lap, and she cried. Not from sadness exactly, from gratitude. The specific, piercing gratitude of realizing that someone who loved you had left you something that protected you long after they were gone, without either of you knowing, at the time, that that was what was happening. The quality of record-keeping she had built her company on, the discipline of knowing your numbers, the belief that keeping track was not optional, was not a personality quirk, was a form of self-respect. It had come from here. from 12 small green notebooks, from a woman with a pencil at a kitchen table. Eleanor, 21 years gone, had just walked into a conference room on the 14th floor downtown and dismantled Douglas Calloway's legal strategy. Meg sat on the floor of a storage unit and let herself understand that. She said, out loud, to no one present and to the one person she most wanted to hear, "I got it, Mom." She sat for 20 minutes. Then she got up. She drove home. She slept for the first time in 2 weeks. Charlotte called at 8 in the morning. "How are you?" she asked. "Ready?" Meg said. They were reviewing the timeline for the mediation approach when Charlotte said, almost as an aside, "Do you remember the Hartman offer?" Meg went still. The coffee mug stopped halfway to her mouth. "Yes," she said. "Tell me what you remember." Meg set the mug down. "Hartman Luxury Group," she said. 12 years ago. They wanted a public partnership. I would have been the visible founder. They were offering capital and platform in exchange for a stake and my name on the brand. And you turned it down. I turned it down. Why? The question was simple. The answer was not. I told myself the company wasn't ready, Meg said, that the timing was wrong, that the exposure was premature. Charlotte said nothing. She was very good at waiting. Meg looked at the window, at the garden. "We had dinner," Meg said slowly. "The night I was thinking it through, Douglas and I mentioned it. I don't even know why I mentioned it. I wasn't going to ask his permission. I was just talking." She stopped. "He said it was a lot of exposure for something that was still early," she said. "He said I didn't want to overreach. He said..." She stopped again, then said it. "He called it a hobby." The word landed in the kitchen the same way it had landed 12 years ago at the dinner table. Small, dismissive, not intended to wound, simply reflecting how he saw it, the honest, careless assessment of a man who had never looked closely. "And you let that close the door," Charlotte said. "I did." "Meg." Charlotte's voice was very even. "If you had taken that offer, the company would be worth conservatively double its current valuation. At minimum." The inner voice arrived not as a whisper, but as a reckoning, full and unsparing. He didn't just betray the marriage. He convinced me to betray myself. And I let him. I gave him my own permission and let him use it against me and called it a marriage and called it love and called it being a good wife. The anger that came with this was different from all the other anger. It was older, deeper. The anger of finding a wound you didn't know was there until someone accidentally pressed on it. "I'm not telling you this to make you angry," Charlotte said. "I know. I'm telling you because what comes next requires no one's permission. It never did. I want you to walk into that mediation room knowing that." "I know it," Meg said. "Do you?" A pause. "Yes," Meg said. And she did. For the first time, completely, she did. 3 days before the mediation, Douglas came to the house. Meg was in the kitchen when she heard the car in the driveway. She had moved to the guest room 2 weeks ago, quietly, without discussion. She had simply gathered her things one evening and moved them down the hall, and Douglas had not commented on it, and she had understood that his silence was its own kind of answer. She heard the front door open, his footsteps on the hardwood. He was going to the office, the converted dining room. He had files there he needed. She was standing at the kitchen counter. She heard him on the stairs, and she did something she had not planned to do. She turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark. She listened to his footsteps move through the hallway above her. She listened to the office door open, the particular sound of a file drawer. Papers collected, the drawer closing. She stood completely still in her own dark kitchen, and she thought, "I have done this my whole married life. Made myself quiet and present and non-demanding so the space around Douglas could be uninterrupted. Pretended to be asleep so I didn't have to have the conversation. Made myself smaller so the room could be bigger for him. His footsteps came back across the hallway, down the stairs. He did not look for her. He did not call her name. He got his files, and he left. The front door closed. The engine started. She heard the car back out of the driveway. She stood in the dark for a long time. The inner voice arrived without drama. I am done making myself absent. It felt like safety. It was also a cage. And I built that part myself. That part was mine. She turned on the kitchen light. She made tea. She sat at the table. She waited for morning. In the morning, she drove to the office and worked for 6 hours straight. The most productive she had been in months. Focused and precise and entirely present. She was ready. The 14th floor of a glass building downtown. The elevator opened onto a corridor with gray carpet and good lighting. A receptionist who was professionally warm and said nothing unnecessary. A waiting area with chairs designed to suggest neutrality. Franklin was already there. He was reviewing notes in a leather folder. He looked up when she arrived and gave her a nod that meant, "We are ready." She nodded back. She was wearing charcoal gray, not black, which announces morning, not anything bright, which announces a performance. Charcoal gray, which says, I have been here the entire time. You simply were not paying attention. She had looked at herself in the bathroom mirror that morning. Not in passing. Not a quick, reassuring glance before moving on. She stood there and looked at herself properly. Something she had not done in years. The woman in the mirror looked back. Silver hair she had stopped apologizing for. Brown eyes that were, she thought, more awake than they had been in a long time. The inner voice, very clear. I am not starting over. I am continuing. Everything I built is still standing. Everything I know is still mine. She walked into the mediation room. Douglas was already seated on the other side of the long table. She saw him. She looked at him the way you look at something you are seeing clearly for the first time after years of looking through it. He looked slightly diminished, not broken, just recalibrated. The certainty had lost some of its luster. He had been briefed that things were more complicated than anticipated, but he still held his shoulders with the particular set of a man who believes he holds the fundamental advantage. He was a man who had always held the advantage. It was architectural for him. Structural. He looked up when she entered. She did not look away. She went to her chair. She sat down. She put her hands on the table. Folded, steady. Gerald Pruitt, on the other side, had the smooth professional confidence of a man who had been in this room many times and knew how it always ended. Bespoke suit. The kind of cufflinks that cost as much as a small vacation. He gave Meg a brief, pleasant nod. The nod of a man who is being professionally courteous to someone he does not consider a complication. The mediator was introduced. The process began. The first hour was procedural. Assets listed. Timeline established. The parameters of the negotiation set out in the careful language of people who are paid to be precise. Gerald Pruitt made arguments about the structure of the marital estate. Douglas sat beside him and occasionally interjected. He was good in rooms like this. Confident, articulate. The kind of man who learned early that certainty reads as authority, and authority reads as correctness. In the second hour, Gerald was making an argument about the speculative nature of projections for closely held businesses. Douglas interrupted. He did this regularly. In rooms, at dinners, mid-sentence. It was one of the things Meg had spent years accommodating, and then stopped noticing, and was now, in this room, watching with a kind of clear-eyed distance she had not previously had access to. Can we be honest about something? Douglas said. He looked at the mediator, then at Franklin, then briefly at Meg, with the particular look of a man who is about to say something he believes is being diplomatically courageous. The company has clearly performed beyond what anyone anticipated, he said. I acknowledge that. But let's be clear about context. It's essentially a hobby that did well. Meg has always been... He paused, searching. Supported. That's the accurate context here. The room went quiet. Meg looked at Douglas, not with the hot, immediate anger she might have had 2 months ago, with something cooler and more complete. The feeling of seeing something entirely, finally, clearly. This is who he is. Not cruel, not calculated. Simply a man who never looked, who looked at 11 years of my work and saw what he expected to see, and expected so little that what he saw was nothing. Franklin Adler opened a folder. For the record, he said in a pleasant, unhurried voice, I'd like to submit Exhibit 17. He slid copies across the table. The independent valuation report from Morton, Vance, and Glass. Gerald Pruitt took the copy. He looked at it. He was quiet. He looked at it again. Douglas took his copy. He looked at the number at the bottom of page 3. He also said nothing, for a period long enough to count. Meg looked at the glass partition beside her. Her own reflection. Gray suit, silver hair, hands folded on the table. She thought of the woman in the hallway holding a cold glass of water. She thought of the woman sitting in a parked car for 45 minutes, unable to make herself go inside. She thought of the midnight pantry, the 3 in the morning searches, the dark kitchen, the pretending to be asleep. She thought of Eleanor and the green notebooks, of Charlotte saying, the model is sound. What do you need? Of Tyler, her son, with her eyes and her quality of watching, sitting somewhere in this city, knowing. She looked at Douglas. Douglas, she said. Her voice was very quiet, but it was complete. It did not trail. I haven't been supported. I've been invisible. Those are 2 very different things. He had nothing to say. Nothing at all. Gerald Pruitt asked for a recess. He needed to make a call. In 13 years of practice, he had never asked for an unscheduled recess. He asked for one now. In the hallway, Meg and Franklin stood at the window wall, the city below them doing its ordinary Friday afternoon, people with briefcases and coffee and their own small urgencies. How are you? Franklin asked. Tired? Meg said. In a good way. The way you're tired after something that cost exactly what it was worth. He nodded. He called it a hobby, she said, not with outrage, almost with wonder. In front of the mediator, 11 years, $430 million, and he called it a hobby. People see what it costs them nothing to see, Franklin said. Yes. She looked at the city, and I made it easy. I kept it small in his eyes because it felt safer. If he had seen it clearly, he would have tried to manage it, and I couldn't have that, so I stayed in the background. And then, she paused. I outgrew the background. I outgrew the whole arrangement. A pause. I'm ready to go back in, she said. Franklin held the door. She walked through it. Tyler Calloway was 22 years old. He had watched his parents carefully for as long as he had been old enough to watch anything. He had a quality his father had always called slowness. The long pause before he spoke, the way he seemed to take things in without responding immediately. It was not slowness, it was precision. He requested to address the room directly. He was a legal adult. His request was granted. He sat down across from the mediator. He looked at his father, then at his mother, then at the mediator. He said, I know what happened. I know what my father did. I know what my grandmother did. I know the shape of all of it. He looked at Douglas. I'm not going to pretend I don't know, he said. He looked at Meg. I've known about my mother's company for 4 years, he said. She told me because she needed someone to know it was real. I kept it to myself because she asked me to, not because my father deserved the protection. He took a breath. I want to go on the record, he said, that any arrangement that disadvantages my mother, who has supported this family in every way she was allowed to, will have consequences for my relationship with my father. That's not a threat. It's information. I'm telling you what is true. He stood up. He left the room. Meg looked at the table. She was not going to cry here. Not in this room. Not with these people. She took one slow, complete breath. She looked up. The inner voice arrived full and warm and certain. I raised that precision, that loyalty, that particular kind of quiet strength that knows the truth and says it plainly. I raised it in him. Whatever this marriage cost, whatever the years cost, that is mine, entirely mine. Nobody can take that. The final terms took 2 more hours to settle. They were not what Douglas's team had envisioned. He retained the family home, which he valued and which was, in the strict accounting of assets, substantially less valuable than what he had expected to negotiate away from her. He retained his business interests, which were genuinely his and had always been. He paid a settlement that reflected accurately the financial dynamics of the marriage. What he had held, what she had contributed in ways that were not strictly financial, the equity of 23 years. He did not get the story, the version of events where he managed the outcome, where he was the one who walked away cleanly, who determined the terms, who handled the situation the way he had always handled situations. With the quiet confidence of a man who assumes the advantage is his before the game has started. Instead, he had the story where he called a $430 million company a hobby in front of a mediator and opposing counsel, where his own attorney asked for an unscheduled recess and came back 17 minutes later looking like a man who had just been told the building was on the wrong foundation. He would live with that. The papers were placed on the table. Gerald Pruitt signed first, then Douglas. His face, as he signed, was the face of a man who has fully understood something he cannot undo the understanding of. He was not laughing. No one in the room was laughing. But Meg knew. She had heard, through Tyler, through the way information moves through families, even broken ones, that there had been laughter, early on, when Douglas and his lawyer and Vivian had discussed how this would go, how Meg would take what she was given, how manageable she was, how she always had been. There was no laughter in this room. The papers came to her side of the table. Franklin slid them across. Meg picked up the pen. She signed her name. Margaret Eleanor Calloway, her full name. She rarely used her middle name on formal documents. Eleanor. She stopped for one moment. She pressed the pen lightly to the page. She thought, Mom, you're in this room. You have been in this room the whole time. Then she finished signing. She slid the papers back across the table. It was done. She walked out of the mediation room, through the gray carpeted corridor, through the lobby of the 14th floor, with its professional quiet, to the elevator bank. She pressed the button. She waited. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. She stepped in. The doors closed. The floor numbers counted down. She crossed the marble lobby, past the reception desk, through the revolving door, onto the sidewalk. September air hit her face, warm still, but with something under it, a first hint of the season turning. The light was the particular gold of late afternoon and early autumn that makes ordinary buildings look briefly beautiful. She stood on the sidewalk. She took a breath, not a careful one, not a managed one, a complete one. The inner voice arrived not dramatically, but simply, like something settling. That took 23 years. and also 11, and also, in some way, every year before either of those. Every year of watching Eleanor count receipts and understanding, without being told, that knowing your own numbers was a form of dignity. She took out her phone. 47 unread messages from Douglas. She read the first one. She put the phone in her bag. She walked to her car. Mind the bots. She did not plan to drive past the house. Her hands took the familiar route. 16 years of left at the light, right at the school, left at the park. The route her body had driven more times than she had consciously counted. She drove past the house. The kitchen light was off. The driveway was empty. Someone had left the garden gate open. The gate Douglas had installed the spring they moved in. The gate Tyler used to swing on before he was told it would ruin the hinges. It would swing in the evening wind tonight. She drove past. She did not slow down. She noted, with something like scientific interest, that she did not feel the expected pull. The grief tug, the urge to stop and look longer. The grief was coming. She was not naive about that. It would arrive at unexpected hours in unexpected forms for years to come. The grief of a marriage that was real before it wasn't. The grief of 23 years that contained, alongside the betrayal, actual mornings, and actual laughter, and an actual son who had her eyes and his father's jaw and a quality of honesty that she hoped he kept his whole life. But not tonight. Tonight there was something different. She drove past the house, and she called Diane. The phone rang twice. "It's done," Meg said. Diane was quiet for 1 second. "Just one. How are you?" she asked. Meg thought about the question. She thought about it properly. "I think I'm okay," she said. "Not fine, okay. There's a difference between them." "There is," Diane said. "I'm going to the airport." A pause on the line. "The airport? Charlotte's planning meeting, Geneva. I've been putting it off for 3 months. I'm not putting it off anymore." Silence. A specific kind of silence that only sisters produce. The kind that contains everything that has ever passed between two people in a shared childhood. Then, Mom would be absolutely impossible right now. Meg laughed, a real laugh, full and slightly wet at the edges and entirely genuine. She would be impossible, Meg agreed. She'd be calling everyone she knew. She'd be calling people she barely knew. She'd frame the valuation report, Diane said. Diane. Still laughing. She absolutely would. "Call me when you land," Diane said. "I will. I love you. I love you too." She hung up. She was still smiling, the specific smile of something that has come all the way through. She called Patsy from the departure lounge. She had thought about this, about what she wanted to say, about whether she was ready. Patsy answered immediately. Just Meg's name. "Hey," Meg said. A pause, both of them in it. 19 years of friendship in a pause. "I'm not in a place where everything is fixed," Meg said. "I want you to know that's true. What you did, what you didn't do, that hurt me. It still does." "I know," Patsy said, very quietly. "But I'm also not in a place where I want to take 19 years and put it in the ground over something that was complicated, and wrong, and human." Patsy exhaled, long and slow. "I was scared," she said. "I'm not saying that as an excuse." "I know you were," Meg said. "That doesn't make it not hurt. It makes it something I can eventually understand. That's different from being fine with it. But it's something." A pause on both sides. 19 years of both sides. "I'm going to Geneva," Meg said. "Geneva," Patsy repeated. "Charlotte's meeting. 3 months overdue." A pause. And then Patsy's voice changed. Became the voice Meg had known for 19 years. The one that was warm and fast and had no patience for pretense. "Meg Calloway," she said. "You absolute force of nature." Meg smiled, looking out through the departure lounge window at the tarmac, the planes in their purposeful lines. "I'll call when I land," she said. "You'd better. Tell me everything." "I will." She hung up. She gathered her things. She went to the gate. At the newsstand, she bought a celebrity magazine with a cover story she had no interest in and a bottle of water that cost $4 more than it should have. The cashier was young, maybe 19, the efficient, half-present energy of someone who has processed hundreds of travelers today and will process hundreds more before the shift ends. "How's your day going?" the cashier asked, without quite meaning it, the automated courtesy of a long shift. Meg looked at her. "It's the best day of my life," she said. The cashier laughed, the particular laugh of someone who hears cheerful exaggerations all day and catalogs them without processing them. She counted back the change. She was already looking at the next customer. Meg did not correct her. She took her change. She walked toward the gate. Private aviation was in the West Terminal. She had walked this corridor before, 22 times in 11 years, always with a specific quality of held breath, a slight hurry, the feeling of someone who was not entirely sure she was allowed to be here, who was borrowing a space that might be reclaimed. She walked differently today. Nobody watching would have been able to name the difference. It was in the quality of her feet on the floor, the way she took up the space of her own body without apology or explanation. She was exactly where she had put herself. The Gulfstream was in position when she arrived. Charlotte's firm operated 3 aircraft for business travel. Meg had flown on this one 14 times over 11 years. Each time, some vestigial part of her had not fully exhaled until the wheels left the ground. Some old voice that said, "You are using something you haven't entirely earned." She boarded. The cabin attendant was a woman close to Meg's age, warm and efficient, with the manner of someone who is exceptional at her work and does not require anyone to say so. "Good to see you, Mrs. Calloway. Geneva looks clear. Approximately 9 hours of flight time." "Thank you," Meg said. She settled into her seat. She put the celebrity magazine in the seat pocket. She looked out the oval window at the tarmac. The afternoon light was going golden across the concrete. The other aircraft moved in their systematic, purposeful patterns, ground crews with their precise and urgent choreography. She opened the new journal. She had bought it 3 days ago at a bookshop near Franklin's office. Impulsively, on the way back to her car, the kind of purchase you make when you sense something will be needed without knowing exactly what for. The pages were blank. She sat with the blankness for a moment. The plane began to move. She picked up the pen. She wrote one sentence. "I thought keeping the peace meant I was peaceful. I was wrong." She looked at the words. She closed the journal. She looked out the window. Something in her chest was loose in a way it had not been in years. Loose not in the way of emptiness, but in the way of openness. There is a difference. She was learning the difference. The wheels left the ground with the particular sound of lift. The city tilted and receded. The buildings became small. The streets became lines. The ordinary geography of her ordinary life arranged itself into something that could be held in a single frame. She watched it go. She thought of the woman who had stood in that hallway, glass of water, cold against her sternum, the voice through the 3/4 closed door. She has no idea. She never does. She had. All along, some part of her had known, had been filing things away in the careful, habitual way she had inherited from Eleanor. Not green notebooks, not receipts, but the particular register of moments that don't match. Looks that end too quickly. Evenings accounted for with a confidence that is slightly too confident. The accumulation of small things she had chosen for years not to open. She thought of Amber Schultz, 31 years old and terrified and making the one phone call that mattered, which was the call for her own lawyer. Meg hoped she had found a good one. She hoped the baby was healthy. She hoped Amber was finding out, at a younger age than Meg had, that the story you are given is not the story you are required to keep. She thought of Vivian. Lavender perfume and pearl earrings, and the confident, damaging love of a mother who believed protecting her son was the same thing as caring for the people her son hurt. Vivian would sit with this. She would make it comfortable for herself eventually, would find a version of events that preserved her own dignity. That was what Vivian did. Meg could not stop that. She also did not have to carry it. She thought of Patsy. Complicated, frightened, imperfect Patsy, who had 8 months and chose silence and knew it was wrong and still chose it because the alternative required more than she believed she had. They would find their way back to something, she thought. It would be different, altered in permanent ways. But 19 years was real, and the real things do not simply evaporate. They change shape. Sometimes they get stronger in the broken places. She thought of Tyler, his father's jaw, her eyes, and that particular quality of stillness before he spoke, which his father had always called slowness, and which was, she had always known, the opposite. The patience of someone who understands that the truth is worth waiting to say correctly. I know what happened, he had said. Simple, complete. The most important sentence in the room. She had raised that precision, that loyalty, that particular kind of quiet strength that recognizes the truth and says it plainly because truth seems to it like the obvious choice. She had raised it. Whatever the marriage had cost, whatever the years had taken, Tyler was hers. That was hers, completely and irrevocably, and no legal proceeding and no rearrangement of assets and no version of events could alter it. She thought of Charlotte, 63 years old and still slightly overdressed for casual occasions, still direct to the edge of rudeness. Still the person who had looked at 3 pages of yellow legal paper 11 years ago and said, "The model is sound. What do you need?" She would see Charlotte in Geneva in 9 hours. Charlotte would look at her the way she had looked at her 11 years ago, with the clear-eyed regard of someone who sees things at their actual size, not the size others assign. She was looking forward to it. She was, she realized, looking forward to a lot of things. The clouds took the city. Above them, the light went blue, white, and clean. The altitude at which everything below looks manageable. The altitude at which you can see the shape of things. She opened the journal again. She looked at the one sentence. I thought keeping the peace meant I was peaceful. I was wrong. She thought about peace, what she had called peace, the particular silence she had maintained in her kitchen and her bedroom and her marriage for 23 years, the way she had made herself still and small and undemanding and called it harmony, called it being good at this. It was not peace, it was the absence of friction. Those are not the same thing. Peace is something you have inside yourself. It does not require silence. It does not require smallness. It does not require pretending to be asleep when someone walks down your hallway. She picked up the pen. She wrote. She wrote about Eleanor at the kitchen table with the green notebook and the pencil and the absolute certainty that knowing your own numbers was not a choice but a basic form of self-respect. She wrote about the day she signed her first contract. A Tuesday in September, 11 years ago, a small Tuscan family who made leather goods by hand the way their grandparents had, who were ready for a larger market, but had no idea how to find one. And she had found them. She had built that bridge from nothing but research and telephone calls and the willingness to get on a plane and sit across from people and look them in the eye and say, "I know how to do this. Trust me." She wrote about the Hartman offer, about the word hobby, said carelessly at a dinner table, about closing a door she had the right to walk through because someone else's thoughtlessness landed harder than his thoughtlessness deserved to land. She wrote about that, about the ways she had participated, not to punish herself, not to diminish what Douglas had done, or what Vivian had done, or what Patsy had done, or what the accumulation of their choices had cost her. But because honesty requires looking at all of it, including yourself, she had made herself invisible in a house where she could have been visible. She had asked for permission in a life where she was the only one qualified to give it. She had taken up exactly the amount of space she was assigned, and no more, and told herself this was virtue. It was not virtue. It was a habit, and habits, however long, can be broken. She had been breaking it for 11 years, actually, in the office, in the partnerships, in the telephone calls and the contracts and the trips to Europe that Douglas called shopping and she called work, and they both knew, somewhere, that the difference mattered, even if only she understood how much. She had been practicing, for 11 years, the skill of being the size she actually was. She just had not brought it home yet. She was bringing it home now. Only home, now, was not the house with the Japanese maple and the kitchen she had reorganized at midnight and the office that used to be a dining room. Home was wherever she was. That was what she was just learning. She wrote about the mediation room, about the moment she said, "I haven't been supported. I've been invisible." Those are two different things. About the moment that was not triumphant. Not a movie scene with swelling music. Just a woman saying a true thing in a beige room to a man who had stopped looking at her long before he had stopped pretending to see her. About the moment she signed her name, Margaret Eleanor Calloway, her mother's name, in the middle of her own. The most important signature she had ever written. About the moment she walked out, through the hallway, into the elevator, across the lobby, through the revolving door, onto the sidewalk, and the September air on her face, and the gold light on the ordinary buildings, and the breath she took, complete and unhurried, and entirely her own, sink. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. Smooth air ahead. Arrival in Geneva at 7:40 in the morning local time. The weather would be clear. Meg looked out the oval window. The clouds were below her now. White and still and enormous, the kind of clouds that look, from above, like another country. She thought about the woman in the hallway one more time, holding a glass of water cold against her sternum. She thought, "You were right to stop. You were right to listen. You were right not to fall apart before you knew everything you needed to know. You were right to call Charlotte. You were right to call Franklin. You were right to say, in that conference room, the true thing. You were right to sign. You were right to walk out. You were right to drive past the house without stopping. You were right to get on this plane." She had been right. Not always. Not in every choice over 23 years. But in the important ones. In the ones that had built something real and lasting and entirely hers. She had been right about that. The cabin attendant brought water and a small arrangement of food Meg had not ordered and did not remember requesting. She ate something without paying much attention to what it was. She was not hungry, but the body needs what it needs, even when the mind is somewhere else. She thought about what Charlotte would say in Geneva. Charlotte would say, "Now we talk about what comes next." That was Charlotte's way. No ceremony around what had been. Unflinching attention to what would be. Meg found, to her surprise, that she knew what came next. Not in the detailed and exhaustive way she knew her financial records. Not yet. But in the way you know the direction before you know the route. The Hartman door had closed 12 years ago. Other doors had opened since, would open again. She had $430 million worth of company and no one to ask permission from. She had a mentor who still saw her at full size. She had a son who knew the truth and said so. She had a sister who answered on the second ring. She had a complicated friendship she was not ready to discard. She had a journal with one sentence in it and many empty pages. She had, against all her expectations, and despite all the months of cold water and midnight pantries and 3 in the morning searches, something she had not been sure she would find on the other side of this. Herself, not a new self, not a reinvented self, not the self that rises from the ashes, dramatic and transformed, with a new wardrobe and a new outlook and a tidy lesson learned. Just herself, the one who had been there the whole time, underneath the performance and the accommodations and the careful smallness. She had simply, at 48 years old, in September, above the clouds, run out of reasons to keep her covered. She opened the journal again. She wrote for a long time. The words came easily. They had always been there. They had simply been waiting for the altitude at which they could finally come out. She wrote about Eleanor's notebooks and what they had built. She wrote about the first time she walked into a room in Europe and said, "I know how to do this. Trust me," and meant it. She wrote about Tyler's eyes. She wrote about Charlotte saying, "The model is sound. What do you need?" She wrote about the specific piece of knowing your own numbers, not just the financial ones, all of them. The accounting of your own life, what you have spent and what it cost and what it was worth and what you have left. She wrote, "The prison door was unlocked the whole time I was my own jailer, and now I'm not." She wrote that and stopped. She looked at it. It was true. It was the truest thing she had written. She closed the journal. She looked out the window. Below her, invisible under the clouds, a city was doing its ordinary things. Taxis and dinner tables and children doing homework and someone reorganizing a pantry at midnight and someone lying in the dark, pretending to be asleep and someone sitting in a parked car counting to 5 before making herself go inside. All of that was real. All of it was happening. And it was also true that above the clouds, a woman named Margaret Eleanor Calloway was sitting in a leather seat with a pen and a journal, and the particular piece of someone who has finally, after a very long time, taken off a mask she did not know she was wearing. Not because someone took it from her, because she decided. The plane flew on. The light outside the window went from gold to dark blue. The stars appeared, one at a time, with the unhurried confidence of things that have been there all along. Meg watched them come out. She thought, "I have been here the whole time." She thought, "I know exactly where I am going." She thought, "I am going to land in Geneva in 9 hours, and I am going to walk into a meeting, and I am going to say what I think without apology, without qualifiers, without the old habit of making my sentences small so they fit inside someone else's comfort. I am going to take up the space I have earned, and then I am going to earn more." She smiled, not the careful smile, not the gracious wife smile, the one she had given at dinner parties for 23 years, warm and appropriate and not quite hers. This smile was hers, entirely hers. Below her, somewhere in a glass building on a 14th floor in a city going dark, a set of signed divorce papers sat in their folders. Final. Done. The last chapter of one story and the first line of the next. She was already writing the next one. Above the clouds, in the blue dark of a September night, somewhere over the ocean, Margaret Eleanor Calloway picked up the pen. And she did not stop.
Margaret Calloway did not win because she was lucky. She did not win because the universe decided finally to be fair to her. She won because of something much quieter than luck. She won because of 11 years of showing up to a desk that nobody knew existed. 11 years of keeping records nobody asked her to keep. 11 years of building something real in the margins of a life that had been designed around someone else's priorities. She won because of a mother named Eleanor, who sat at a kitchen table with a green notebook and a pencil, who believed, with her whole quiet self, that knowing your own numbers was not optional, that keeping track was not a personality quirk, that understanding the accounting of your own life was an act of dignity. That lesson passed from a mother to a daughter, without either of them knowing it would one day matter in a room with lawyers and a mediator and papers that ended 23 years. But here is what I want you to sit with. Because the most important thing in this story is not the $430 million. The most important thing is the moment Meg realized she had participated in her own disappearance. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic scene, by inches. One small permission handed over at a time, one qualified sentence replaced by silence, one door closed because someone used a word like hobby in a tone that was not cruel, just careless. And she let that carelessness determine what was possible. How many of us have done that? How many of us have made ourselves the right size for someone else's comfort? Have softened the sentence, have moved to the edge of the photograph, have pretended to be asleep when the hard conversation was coming down the hallway. How many of us have been building something real, quietly, persistently, in the margins of a life that does not fully see us, and have not yet let ourselves name it at full volume? This story is for you, not as a blueprint, not as a fantasy, as a mirror. Because the lesson is not, go build a company and surprise everyone at your divorce. The lesson is older and simpler and harder than that. The lesson is, know your own numbers, all of them, not just the financial ones. Know the accounting of your own life. Know what you have given. Know what it cost. Know what it was worth. Know what you have left. Know the difference between keeping the peace and simply being quiet about your own existence. Know when you have been invisible and call it what it is. Not with bitterness, with accuracy. And then, and this is the part that takes the most courage, stop asking permission. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that requires an audience. Just stop. Stop qualifying. Stop softening. Stop taking up exactly the assigned amount of space and no more. Take the space your life has earned. Because here is the truth. Margaret understood at 48 years old, above the clouds, with a journal and a pen and the particular peace of someone who has finally put down a weight she did not realize she had been carrying. The prison door was unlocked the whole time. She was her own jailer. And so, very possibly, are you. The moment you stop, the moment you decide to be the size you actually are, that is not a beginning. That is a returning to something that was always there. Quiet, persistent, waiting, just like she was. To every woman listening who has ever felt invisible inside a life she helped build, this story was made for you. You are not small. You are only unseen. And those are two very different things. Final closing statement. The content you just heard was manually researched, carefully constructed, and thoughtfully edited by our team, not generated in a moment, but built with intention. Every character, every emotional layer, every lesson woven into this story was chosen deliberately, because we believe that the stories we tell each other matter. They carry healing, they carry recognition, and sometimes they carry the exact truth someone needed to hear today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for trusting us with your time.